Hello again. If you've been paying attention to what we've been doing here on our YouTube channel, you've noticed that over the course of the last 25 weeks, we have been uploading hour-long videos of our midweek teaching of our Systematic Theology series. And video takes a lot of time, and so I haven't been doing as many of these short teaching videos as I used to in the past. But I'm looking forward to doing more. Folks have been sending me email, asking questions, and we'll just see what the future holds. I'm hoping to get to do more of this kind of thing. Anyway, an email came in recently that said, "Hi Jim, I love your videos on YouTube as well as your sermons on salvationbygrace.org. Thanks very much. Sure do appreciate that. I was wondering if there was a sermon or a teaching that you have where you cover the phrase exegetical imperative. I've heard you mention it. I believe I understand what you mean by it, and I agree with you on it. Could you make a YouTube video dealing with it?" Well, sure. So let's do that. Let's start by defining the terminology, because let's not assume that people out there just know all of this big theological jargon. Two words, exegetical and imperative. Exegesis is simply the process of explaining something, drawing meaning from a text and then explaining that text based on the meaning. And so I engage in a lot of exegesis in the teaching that I do of the Bible. I'm absolutely committed to the idea that we have to understand what the original authors were attempting to tell us. The opposite of exegesis is eisegesis, and that essentially means putting meaning into the text, bringing our assumptions or our traditions with us, and then looking at the Bible and forcing our traditions, our assumptions, our presuppositions into the text. That's the opposite of exegesis. Exegesis is the process by which we read the text, study the text, look at the text in the original languages, whatever it takes to understand what the original authors were attempting to tell us. What words did they use? What order were those words in? Why did they choose these particular words? What is the context? All of that in order to understand the meaning of a text. Now, the word exegesis actually migrated right from the Greek language through the Latin into the English language, essentially unchanged. You don't find that noun, exegesis, anywhere in the New Testament, but we do find in John 1:18 the verb form of that word. Exegeomai is the verbal form of the word. John 1:18 says, "No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him." Some of the other translations say, "He has explained him." So this process, exegeomai, this process of exegeting, is the same as Jesus explaining God to us, because none of us have ever seen him at any time, so the only way we're going to understand him is for someone to explain him to us, and that is precisely what Jesus did when he was here on the planet. So that's the word, exegesis, to explain, to lay out, to declare something, to draw meaning from the text and explain the text on that basis. Now, the other word is imperative. An imperative is a command. It might be helpful to, if you haven't already, go and take a look at my video called The Indicative and the Imperative. A lot of folk have given me a lot of real positive feedback about that particular video, and I'm grateful for the feedback. Basically, an indicative indicates it's what you are. An imperative is an instruction. Do this. Now, when you put those two words together, exegetical imperative, the first time I came across that phrase or that combination of two words was years ago when I was living in Los Angeles and consuming a lot of theology books. And an author, and I honestly don't remember who, used that phrase, but the way that he used it was actually different than the way I use it now. What he was saying was that in order to truly understand the Bible, we obviously had to engage in proper exegesis. And he called that the exegetical imperative. It's absolutely imperative that we engage in exegesis in order to rightly understand what the Bible is telling us. However, the way that I use the phrase these days is a little bit different. Usually, I use it when discussing / arguing / debating with folk who have come to faulty conclusions about what a particular text might say, or they've come to a faulty conclusion about some biblical doctrine, and then they have used some out-of-context portion of a verse or portion of a passage in order to defend their misunderstanding. And I will reply to them and say that there is no exegetical imperative in their text of choice that would necessarily lead them to the conclusion that they have arrived at. In other words, what I'm saying is, an exegetical imperative to me is when you read something in the Bible that once you do the basic exegesis, you arrive at an inescapable conclusion. It's an imperative that you get to this point with this text. It's a command. The text itself lays out the command. For instance, when Jesus in John 3 says to Nicodemus, "You must be born again." The word is anothen, from above. You must be born from above. Okay, well, that's a perfect example of a place where we're driven into a corner. There's an inescapable conclusion right in that text. The inescapable conclusion is our first birth, our physical birth, is not sufficient. We need something else. We need another birth. We need a birth from above. We need a spiritual rebirth, a regeneration. Something else has to happen to us if we're going to be accepted, if we're going to be saved, if we're going to stand before the throne of God and be fully accepted. So you have to be born again. Inescapable conclusion. You must be born again. Now that, to me, is what I'm talking about when I say an exegetical imperative. If you do even the most perfunctory exegesis on that verse, you're forced into a corner where you have to conclude that Jesus is saying that we need something more than just our physical birth in order to be saved. It's an imperative. There's your conclusion. Now, on the other hand, there are folk who will, let me give you an example of a bad bit of exegesis that does not include an exegetical imperative. Some folk, when they read Revelation 20 and they read the phrase 1,000 years, conclude that 1,000 years doesn't mean 1,000 years. And what they'll say is that Revelation 20, starting at verse 1, is actually a recapitulation of the same series of events that have already been described 6 times in the book of Revelation. So the book of Revelation recapitulates information 7 times throughout the duration of the book itself. But if you do some basic exegesis on the text itself, Revelation 20, you find that Revelation 20 verse 1 starts with the word kai, and throughout chapters 19 and chapters 20, or throughout chapters 19 and 20, that would be the proper grammar, what we see in the original Greek is that John used the phrase kai, versions of kai huto, kai, and then, throughout chapters 19 and 20. And it is a consistent, unbroken pattern. There was this, and then this, and then this, and then this. And if it weren't for the insertion of the number 20, or the verse 1 right at that point, if you were just reading the original Greek text, there's no hint, there's no indication that at that particular point that we call chapter 20, verse 1, there's no indication that John is now either starting a new idea or beginning another recapitulation of something he's already said. There's nothing in the exegesis that would draw that or force that conclusion on you. It's not an inescapable conclusion. It's not an exegetical imperative. Instead, it's the result of a system, a hermeneutic, a foregone conclusion, and so people force that meaning into the text, even though the text itself doesn't force you to that conclusion. So, when I use the phrase exegetical imperative, what I mean is, when you look at a verse, when you look at a passage, does it force you to an inescapable conclusion? When you do the exegesis, does it force you into a corner and make you come to a conclusion? That happens frequently in the Bible, and I really like it when it happens in the Bible, because I like inescapable conclusions. Then there's no argument, there's no debate. This is what it says. And the Bible does that a lot. So we need to make sure that when we do our exegesis, when we read the scripture, when we pay attention to the text, that we do our best to draw the meaning out of the text, that we don't force our presuppositions or our systems onto the text. And if we just let the text speak, it will say exactly what it means to say, and the meaning of the original authors will come through. And so when that happens, that's an exegetical imperative. I hope that makes some sense. If all I've done is muddy up the waters, feel free to drop me an email. But exegetical imperative, one of my favorite concepts. I like it when the Bible tells us what it means and means what it says, and we're forced to come to particular conclusions or understandings based on what the text says. That is an exegetical imperative. Thanks for listening. See you again.